20-volume folios will never make a revolution. It's the little pocket pamphlets that are to be feared. Cracker Jack swapped their trademark toys out for crap like postage stamp-sized pictures of toys way back before most of you were born. And in 2016, they dropped even that little trinket for QR codes you can use to go to a browser game. It's not like you even need the QR codes. You can just go to the website and play any of these games you want, with or without proof of purchase. I get that in this era of cost-cutting and commercial brutalism, with shareholders demanding to know why you're giving the consumer so much value for their dollar, you're not getting any bonuses with your snacks. But here's what I don't get. Why did Bazooka Joe stop packing comic strips with their bubble gum in the early 2010s? They swapped them out with these lame-ass brain teasers, which must have cost exactly the same to produce and print. After enough time had passed to ensure nobody remembered Bazooka Joe comics or gave a shit anymore, they started to pack the comics in the wrappers again. But just like Mad Magazine did around the same time, they weren't producing any new material. They were just reprinting the old stuff, picking out 48 strips from the first and second generation run of the comic. It beats unwrapping your bubble gum and getting a dumb riddle, but how expensive can it be to commission a new Bazooka Joe comic? They're so tiny, even the drawing materials shouldn't add up to more than a penny or two. Anyway, the fact that they didn't have comic strips included with the gum for most of the 2010s has created a kind of generational gap. If you're in your 20s right now, there's a chance that you've never opened a piece of bubble gum and found a free comic strip inside. And I guarantee you never dug your grimy little hands into a cereal box to pull out the toy. Let's just jump right into the early history of the comic strip. Pornography. Bazooka Joe's creative team is always drawn from the hippest of the underground comic scenes. Art Spiegelman, Craig Yoe, Jay Lynch. Robert Crumb actually worked with the brand on a training manual for salesmen, though he never drew any of the actual strips. This history with the indies dates back to the origins of the comic, when Topps recruited Wesley Morse to develop a mascot for the bubblegum. If it weren't for Bazooka Joe, Morse would probably be most famous as the only confirmed Tijuana Bibles creator. If you've never seen a Tijuana Bible, these were the Rule 34 hentai comics of their day. Satirical pornographic stories, frequently featuring celebrities in compromising positions. Printed off the grid in these stapled, pocket-sized pamphlets and distributed like dime bags.
Price of the brick going up.
These pamphlets were legitimately illegal back then. The cops actually conducted an investigation and raided the Jewett Printing Company, sending publisher Charles Jewett away to a state workhouse for 6 months on obscenity charges. What you're looking at right now is unfunny vaudeville comedian Ben Blue. Not only is he not funny, I wouldn't fuck him with a stolen dick. But check out this Ben Blue Tijuana Bible that Morse drew. Now that's comedy. This feels like a long-running tradition in pop entertainment. Pee-wee's Playhouse called on Gary Panter to do set design, and Nickelodeon Magazine used to run an insert pamphlet entitled The Comic Book, featuring art from some of the 90s greatest edgelords like Johnny Ryan. If you want to make kids laugh, you go to the sleaze merchants. The Wesley Morse Era, 1954 to 1983. Topps art director and Popsicle Pete creator Woody Gelman hired Wesley Morse to develop the Bazooka Joe character based on the quality of Morse's various magazine illustrations, comic strips, and, of course, the Tijuana Bibles. Like Hank Ketchum had done with Dennis the Menace, Wesley turned to his own son, Tally, for inspiration in creating Bazooka Joe. His first shot at the character's visual design was essentially a straight caricature of Tally, but Gelman felt that some tweaks needed to be made to turn Joe into a memorable advertising icon. Now, the eye patch. In 1951, C.F. Hathaway, a small shirt maker in Maine, hired David Ogilvy to run an advertising campaign that was intended to compete with industry giants on a shoestring budget. Ogilvy was on his way to a photo shoot for the new ads when he stopped into a drugstore to buy some cheap eye patches. And I guess Ogilvy was the type of fella to say, "Now a silly one," while doing group photos, because he talked the photographer into doing a few shots with the eye patches, and right away they knew they had something interesting. Ogilvy called it story appeal, his theory being that seeing this handsome one-eyed man modeling a dress shirt, you can't help but wonder how he lost his eye. Case in point, right now you're expecting me to tell you how Bazooka Joe lost his eye, right? There is a semi-canonical explanation, but the creative explanation is that Gelman saw the Hathaway ad and, knowing a good idea when he sees it, swiped the eye patch. The Hathaway campaign was a huge success, by the way. They spent about $3,000 on that first ad run, and within a week, every Hathaway shirt in the city had been sold. The eye patch became a kind of a zeitgeisty thing in 1954, with Bazooka Joe having debuted the year prior, and then Sammy Davis Jr. losing his eye in a car accident, and Zsa Zsa Gabor using a patch to hide a domestic violence incident, or maybe to corroborate one. The eye patch became a thing in the mid-1950s, sort of like steel chairs in 2023. The blonde hair we can probably attribute to the same design principles as Mario's mustache and overalls. An individual Bazooka Joe panel was about the width of a pistachio, and printing was so imprecise that they had to put symbols on superheroes' chests just so you could tell who was who. The blonde hair would simply pop a little better given the production tools they had available at the time. With the Bazooka Joe design finalized, the next step was to fill out the supporting cast. Kid gangs were a big thing back then, and you could probably draw a straight line of influence from Our Gang and the Dead End Kids all the way up to the Goonies and Stranger Things. Bazooka Joe's crew of homies followed along the same archetypes. You had the tough kid, Butch, sort of a miniature Popeye the Sailor Man, girlfriend Janet and her little sister Pats, Hungry Herman the fat kid, Joe's cowboy-obsessed little brother Pesty, and Walkie Talkie, Joe's talking dog who looks a bit like Pete the Pup from the Little Rascals. You're probably asking, what about the turtleneck guy? Well, he wasn't part of the original pitch, but he was a member of the Wesley Morse Era lineup, being added in later strips as the series went on. Morse drew on his son Tally not only for the visual inspiration for Bazooka Joe, but for story material as well. Tally reports seeing his own misadventures reflected in the strips, more than a few times. Like when he embarrassed himself crashing a new bicycle he'd been showing off, or when he and his friends sent a baseball flying through a neighbor's window, and hoped it wouldn't get back to his dad, only to see it turn up on the drawing board. This is considered to be the most iconic era for the brand, and I think a big part of that comes down to the authenticity of the material, which made it deeply relatable for kids in the 1950s. The lame vaudeville-style jokes haven't really changed much over the years, but the context was integral to the strip's success. Losing your trunks at the swimming hole, getting chased up a tree by a mean dog. I guess that sounds so quaint that it might as well be made up, but bear in mind they didn't have video games back then. If you ever go looking into Dennis the Menace, you'll find that Hank Ketchum's relationship with his son was not great. But Tally Morse, I don't want to get into it too much because he's not really a public figure, but he and his dad got along great. Tally still does what he can to honor Wesley's legacy, having written a touching essay for Top's 60th anniversary collection, Bazooka Joe and His Gang, a book I'm drawing on pretty heavily for this video. As an adult, Tally went into the film business, working in the production end on movies like Requiem for a Dream and Ghost Dog. A lifelong smoker, Wesley Morse passed at the fairly young age of 66, so the math doesn't add up, right? If Morse passed in 1963, how does the Morse era stretch from 53 to 83? Well, he was so incredibly prolific that Topps actually had another 20 years of comic strips to print after his departure. These were padded out with supplemental strips authored by various freelancers, but if you were reading Bazooka Joe in 75 or 80, you were reading Wesley Morse. And so it would be until the Howard Cruse Era, 1983 to 1990. Topps hired underground cartoonist Howard Cruse to oversee the franchise's first reboot. Where Morse's early work had been literally pornographic, Cruse's underground comics were remarkably wholesome. He was best known for Barefoots, about this goofy little Precious Moments guy with giant feet. These comics did deal with sexuality, among other adult topics, but in a manner far less vulgar, less explicit than did Morse's Tijuana Bibles, and indeed far less explicit than did Cruse's contemporaries like Robert Crumb.
Why do I have my particular sexual proclivities? I don't know. Ask a psychiatrist. I don't know.
In the underground comics world of the era, Barefoots made Cruse as iconoclastic a cartoonist as Morse's filthy porno drawings had made him in the 1930s and 40s. Howard Cruse had been openly gay throughout his entire career, but never really dealt with it head-on in his work until 1979, when Dennis Kitchen hired him to edit Gay Comics, an anthology highlighting the work of openly queer creators. At the same time as Cruse was working on the new Bazooka Joe, he was drawing his own strip, Wendell, for gay news magazine The Advocate. Here, Cruse would explore topics facing the queer community at the time like AIDS, gay bashing, and the growing gay rights movement. For the 1983 relaunch, Cruse would develop a whole new cast of characters for Bazooka Joe, keeping only Joe and Mort, now aged up to their teens. The strip would be set in the 1980s and given a hip new appearance. but the humor would remain essentially as cornball as ever. As gag contributor Robert Sikoriak suggested, this insistence on dusty vaudeville-style humor in the era of Watchmen, American Splendor, and The Dark Knight Returns would constitute a statement by the context in which it was published. While the comics industry underwent a renaissance in content and tone, biff boom zing, not just for kids anymore, one of its boldest innovators would make his own postmodern statement by continuing a 30-year tradition of dad jokes and one-dimensional characters with nothing more than a fresh coat of paint. The new cast included girlfriend Val, a tomboy car mechanic and aspiring astronaut, her best friend Robin, a self-help addict, bully Shades, and his dog Blotch, and replacing little brother Pesty, little sister Bazooka Jane, with her cat Paws. As Pesty was obsessed with cowboys, Jane was obsessed with the stock market, and her bio states that while she looks up to Joe, she thinks that, quote, his ambition lacks focus. You know, in what I think is her very first appearance, Robin talks about trying to hook up with Joe, so Val needs better friends. I like this new cast just fine, but they made a big mistake in cutting Mort's turtleneck down and showing the bottom half of his face. You know whose idea that was? Art Spiegelman. Yeah, he thought the half-mask turtleneck was a bit much. Thankfully, this was corrected in the second half of the decade when a Topps executive registered his complaint with the change, and Cruse pulled the turtleneck back up to Mort's nose. Where Morse's strips pretty much ran until they were fresh out of them, Cruse's run was actually halted in mid-production. You know that gag contributor we were talking about, Robert Sikoriak? He actually never got to see any of his jokes in print. Not for Bazooka Joe anyway. And his roughs remained just that, never to be illustrated by Howard Cruse, because Topps had decided to revamp the series once again for the 1990s. The Jay Lynch Era, 1989 to 1995. It's a bit misleading to call the early 90s batch the Jay Lynch Era, because Lynch had been a writer on Bazooka Joe since the 1960s. But 1989 was the year Topps decided to give the strip another revamp, putting Jay in charge of the character's second reboot. If you've heard of Jay Lynch, it's probably because he was the editor-in-chief for Bijou Funnies, one of the foundational comics of the early underground movement alongside Zap Comics. Bijou Funnies was sort of the underground answer to Mad Magazine, an anthology comic edited by Lynch and featuring pieces by pretty much everyone, from Skip Williamson to Kim Deitch and Art Spiegelman, and one of my personal favorites, Rory Hayes. In fact, the final issue of Bijou Funnies featured a cover illustrated by none other than Harvey Kurtzman. Oh, you don't know who that is. Look him up. I'm not giving you the 15-second version of this man's career. He is the titan of American comics. Anywho, this was the final issue of Bijou Funnies for the same reason Wesley Morse's publisher did jail time: obscenity laws. The underground comics of the hippie era were distributed largely by head shops. Back when weed was pretty much 100% illegal, you could still buy bongs and shit at these head shops that were basically hippie convenience stores. You could pick up zigzags and blacklight posters and whatever else, as long as everyone pretended that it was all to be used for harmless tobacco. This was the main distribution system for underground comics because this was how you reached the hippies, freaks, and burnouts who read this stuff. In 1973, the Supreme Court case Miller v. California ruled that communities could enforce their own interpretation of obscenity, potentially barring underground comics from First Amendment protections. This would put the head shop owners, already dancing around increasingly strict anti-drug laws, at risk of serious fines and imprisonment. The underground comics industry tried shifting to a mail-order business model, but look, man, asking a hippie to fill out an order form is like asking a hippie to fill out an order form. So all of this is to say that Jay Lynch was another in a line of bold trailblazers to helm Bazooka Joe. Lynch's run trimmed the gang down just as Cruse had, with, again, Joe and Mort the only holdovers. Joe was now a jock, with a new girlfriend in the shopaholic Xena, new buddies in guitarist Metal Dude and his girlfriend, fitness freak Ursula, and Mort was reimagined as an absent-minded professor type, an idiot savant genius at physics and chemistry, but often forgetting to put pants on and I guess going to school with his dick out. Each character was introduced with these little raps, which I'm not going to be singing for you. This was the era I grew up with. These characters easily could have filled out the extended cast of the Bill and Ted animated series, or like Weird Science or something. Again, the look and subject matter of the strip was updated, and again, the tone and humor was left essentially untouched, with Jay Lynch himself stating that the appeal of the comic had always been how unhip and cornball it was. The Jay Lynch era was a single run of 50 strips, which would accompany the bubblegum until 1996 with the launch of the Craig Yoe Era. 1996 to 2003. The final stretch of Bazooka Joe comics in the 20th century was a 79-strip run by Craig Yoe and Yoe Studios. Yoe has had a long career in publishing, working mainly as an archivist and historian, salvaging many of the more obscure bits of comic book history. I mainly know him for his work in preserving horror comics. You probably know that Tales from the Crypt was based on a comic book series by EC Comics, but they were just one of the tentpole attractions of a vast genre of gruesome anthology publications. Yoe has also overseen Cabbage Patch Kids, My Little Pony, Big Boy, like from the restaurant. He was the editor-in-chief for Big Boy magazine. Craig Yoe also oversaw the creative end of the Muppets empire until Jim Henson's death in 1990. Anyway, his brief run on Bazooka Joe saw the cast going through another overhaul. Again, Joe and Mort were the only holdovers. This time we had just 4 names to memorize in total, with AJ and Kara being the new additions. AJ was a blues guitarist and a self-proclaimed ladies' man with dreams of stardom. And Kara was an animal lover and serial entrepreneur, starting one new business after another. Mort was envisioned as a chill, new-agey guy this time around, and Joe was a hip every dude. His bio reading that girls dig him and guys respect him. So, once more, a fresh coat of paint, but the same old corny jokes. The Craig Yoe strips ran until 2003, when Topps cycled them out for reprints of the Morse Era comics until 2006. The Paul Cherrie Era, 2006. Bazooka Joe had one last rodeo under the leadership of Paul Cherrie, who had been the CEO of Concord Confections in an era where they oversaw the Double Bubble brand, reportedly tripling sales before selling the brand off to Tootsie Roll Industries. Paul Cherrie saw Bazooka Joe as needing a major overhaul because, as he puts it, the jokes aren't funny and Joe was, quote, a little dweeb. He also said nobody understands the power of Bazooka better than him. Cherrie developed his new take on Bazooka Joe by surveying kids across the country, who gave him the idea of basing the new Joe on disgraced television star Ashton Kutcher. From there, he figured it was time for a diverse, modernized cast of characters, introducing tomboy Casey McGavin, music snob DJ Change, environmentalist Cindy Lewis, science geek Kevin Griffin, and German exchange student Wolfgang Spreckles. Joe and Mort were, of course, the only returning characters for the new generation, with Cherrie calling Mort Kramer for kids. Cherrie was handed the reins in response to complaints from shareholders who had been threatening to sell their shares if Topps proved unable to increase sagging sales, with purchases down by around 50% at this time. Packaging bore the depressing signs of late-stage capitalist brutalism and cost-cutting. The comics were now monochrome blue and printed directly onto the inside of the wrapper, shaving fractions of a percent off of packaging costs. This meant that they were basically impossible to read, being printed on this cheap, thin wax paper. If it sounds like I'm being ungenerous, well, the comic strips themselves are acceptable. The art is kind of charmless, in my opinion, but the jokes, for all of Paul Cherrie's talk of revitalizing the brand, are as corny and lame as they've ever been, and I mean that as a positive. My favorite sees DJ Change hosting a nightclub in his locker, and then Bazooka Joe says he'll never get in there. Change says, of course not, you're not on the list. From a design perspective, these strips are lousy. The appeal of Bazooka Joe has a lot to do with seeing gifted cartoonists utilizing a very limited tool set, but the monochrome blue comics seem to be laid out as if they know we're going to be reading them on the internet, not on the wrapper. Everything about them works if the strip is 6 inches across, but shrink it down to fit in a matchbox and backgrounds become cluttered, character designs are too complicated, and the halftones make the whole thing hard to decipher at a glance. The Paul Cherrie Era was a 50-strip run lasting just 1 year, long enough to give the brand a spit shine and pawn it off on famous piece of shit Michael Eisner for about $400 million.
See you at Disneyland. Bring money.
The Michael Eisner Era, 2007 to 2023. Eisner began his administration by asking the internet for free art via a contest to redesign Bazooka Joe. The contest inspired some of the most sterile, joyless redesigns yet, settling on the blandest of the bunch, with a brand manager reporting that the design kept tradition, but with a few detailed tweaks like, quote, a freckled face to reflect the children of today. I wasn't around in the 1950s, but I think they had freckles back then. With the launch of the redesigned Bazooka Joe, there is a promise to retain Mort and relaunch with a brand new gang, with Eisner stating that Bazooka Joe would be the new Mickey Mouse. He even announced plans to develop a feature film starring the little bastard. Well, damn near 20 years later, and nothing's come of any of that. In fact, it was under Eisner's management that they would briefly drop the comic strip inserts altogether, which to my knowledge, is the first time since Joe's debut that Bazooka bubblegum has been sold without any comics. It doesn't seem like Michael Eisner did much with the brand in the 16 years he held it. Over the last year or so, the brand became unusually active on the internet. A trailer for a short documentary boasts 1.7 million views on YouTube, while the documentary itself just 4,000. The website is all spruced up with browser games and pop art features, and it seems to me this isn't an effort to sell more bubblegum so much as it's an effort to sell Bazooka Joe's potential to the new buyer, Apex Funds, an investment company that bought the whole shop from Eisner in August of 2023 for around $700 million. Adjusting for inflation, this means that Eisner made a profit of around $100 million for not really doing a damn thing with the property. As of the time of this recording, Apex have not announced any specific plans for the gum, so at present, Joe is still in that phantom zone it's been in for the last 20 years with the Fantastic Four. Nobody really wants to do anything with the characters. They just want to hold on to the rights in a multi-million-dollar game of keep away. Frequently asked questions. Alright, here's the part you skipped to. Why the eye patch? The official answer from Topps is that it's an affectation. Joe wears it to look cool because he's pretentious. But this Howard Cruse strip sees a character apologizing to Joe after making a crack about a sharp stick in the eye. This strip was never intended for publication. It was passed around the offices as an inside joke, but I'm calling it canon, or as close to a canon explanation as we've got. What about Mort's turtleneck? We'll have to really stretch the definition of canon here, but Sikoriak did provide an explanation in this satirical piece for The Onion. Mort wore his turtleneck to his nose as an adolescent, then pulled it down in his teens, then pulled it back up towards the end of Cruse's run. So my theory is he wore it like that as a gag when he was a kid, then suffered a horrible accident in science class, and began covering his face as a practical measure. What's with the name? Was Joe a child soldier or something? The bazooka for which the gum and the character and the weapon were named was actually a musical instrument. Anti-tank weapons were given the nickname bazooka because of their visual resemblance to the musical instrument. Bazoo is old-timey slang for the mouth, or boastful talk, so excellent name for a bubblegum and for a smart-ass kid. Was Bazooka Joe ever funny? I read hundreds of Bazooka Joe strips while making this video, and there was one that made me laugh out loud. Incidentally, it was pulled from later prints for being too funny. Is there a complete collection available? No. The 60th anniversary collection gathers a couple hundred of the 1,500 plus strips published. Even going straight to the source, few of the artists and writers have kept any of their own strips, and Topps archives are incomplete. Even the most prolific Bazooka Joe collectors have big gaps in their collections, and it seems like hundreds of these strips are simply lost forever with no surviving prints. Remember that we're talking about literal pieces of trash here. It's a miracle any of these strips have survived in the first place. So, if there's anything left to be said on the matter, it's don't send me a bunch of Bazooka Joe shit like plush doll crap like that. I'm not going to be the Bazooka Joe guy. I'm not going to be the Quentin Reviews of Bazooka Joe, and I'm just going to throw all that shit in the trash where it belongs. I mean it. If you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.